Hey everyone, this is a review of the Kreg Rip Cut Saw Guide. It attaches to a generic circular saw and it will help you make straight, accurate cuts along a sheet of plywood or similar material as long as it's got a straight edge to reference off of. So let's take a look at what this thing does, how to set it up, and what I think about it. Alright, so this is the saw base. It's a universal base, should fit any left or right bladed saw. And before you start out, this is a 1 1/8 inch width gap. You want to check with the saw you want to use this with to make sure this blade guard is not thicker than 1 1/8 inches or even right up against that, because if you don't, every time you use this it's going to drag against the edge or get stuck up above here, which is kind of dangerous if your saw guard is not retracting back down. The way this base works, it works with both the AccuCut and the Rip Cut. You just won't use some features on one or the other. So it's a universal base, fits most saws. I haven't found a saw that it doesn't fit. You've got a stop block right here. You can loosen this. It's got a nut that holds it in place and can slide back and forth. And what this does is once you get everything set up, you set this up against it nice and tight. And if you take the saw off to make regular cuts with it, you can just reference against this corner when you go to put it back on, and you don't have to do the setup all over again. It's really nice and convenient. These clamps clamp down on the front of your saw and it holds it in place, and you can put them in place here and swivel them back and forth. You've got quite a range of adjustment you can make with these in case your saw blade or your saw base is a little bit differently shaped. And these nuts on the back here are not captive. It's a little bit annoying. I wish they kind of had them built in on both these spots. But you can move them back and forth if you need to get a different geometry setup if your saw base isn't fitting with the current one, with the outer one. This little insert here at the bottom pops out, and that's just in case if the front of your saw shoe has a ramp or not. If it's completely flat, you want to put this side face up. If it's got a ramp, you want to put this side face up, and it just helps it hold it in place a little bit better so you aren't kind of cantilevering your whole saw base back up in the air. This clamp on the front is what lets you adjust the rail back and forth, and you've got a cursor that will tell you on the rail where this is set up, and you can adjust this sideways back and forth in about 1/32 of an inch increments. To set up your saw, first unplug it or take the battery out. Then I would suggest putting this right off the edge and fitting your saw on top. Now I've already got mine set up with this stop in the corner so that references to the right spot, but really you just want to make sure your blade guard has clearance to do this in between when you're pushed all the way up against the front of your shoe against this right angle surface. Once you've got it set up like that, I just hang it off the edge of your workbench to do this. You can arrange these swivels in the right spot. And I would actually tighten down this stop first. You can just pull the whole thing forward and against that corner. Tighten down these screws to stop these from swiveling. And then tighten down the set screws. Don't tighten them too much. You just need to see the start of this rising. If you tighten them down too much, it will stress the plastic on this sled. And that's one of my main complaints about this saw guide, is it's not a glass-filled nylon, it's just a regular plastic, and it doesn't feel super sturdy. I haven't broken mine. I've had this about 3 months. I've had the AccuCut even longer, but it's just, I kind of feel like I have to baby it whenever I've got it on here, especially if you're using a much heavier saw. This light saw doesn't really feel like it's stressing it too much, but with a big saw, like that 12-pound, 7 1/4 inch Gen 2 fuel, that thing's huge, and it feels like it's stressing this plastic a little too much. Setup of the rail is pretty straightforward. You just need a screwdriver, and I would recommend a square as well, just to make sure you get things locked down properly. It does have these pegs that will help you get everything square. One thing I don't like about this is these screws are like the cut your own threads in plastic style of screws. I really would have liked to see a captive nut in these, just because if you have a left and a right bladed saw that you want to use this guide with, you're going to have to keep swapping these back and forth, and these holes are going to get damaged over time. I've already had this uninstalled and reinstalled 3 or 4 times, and I'm really worried that the threads are eventually going to give way in this plastic. So anyway, to set it up, if you have a left bladed saw, do it in this configuration. If you have a right bladed saw, flip it 180 degrees and it will sort everything out for you. Then you just line this up with these pegs and pop it in place. And I would check for square at this point, which it is showing me it's square. So no worries there. I would just double check with your setup. Then all you've got to do is screw these in to clamp everything together. So once you've got the rail assembled and the sled installed on your saw, then you just got to make sure this clamp is loose, because you got the bottom portion of this clamp right here just follows the contour of the guide. And the easiest way to do that is hold it upright and push this up against the top, and it slides in pretty easily. 9 times out of 10 I can get it to slide right in without having to jiggle this around. For the rest of the setup, I'd recommend hanging your saw blade off the edge of the table and make sure the battery or the cord is unplugged, just for safety. And then I flip the whole thing over and retract my guard on the saw. I just slide this whole thing right up against the blade. Do it gently though, so you don't deflect the blade sideways. Once you've got it up against the blade, go ahead and lock it down on the front with this lever. That's just pushing this forward. Now you've got a cursor right here. I set that to 0 since the blade is up against this guide. Then for your first cut, loosen this up, and I would recommend doing about 1.5 inches in some scrap material. And the reason behind this is that was 0. The lines only start at 1 inch because they don't recommend cutting thinner strips than 1 inch. So if you make a cut and you're a little bit less than this, you won't be able to adjust it with a tick mark. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a cut and measure our cutoff piece and see if it's 1.5 inches. If it's not, say it's 1 7/16 instead of 1.5, we'll just move this cursor over so it matches the width of our cutoff piece, and there you have it. You've got this calibrated. All right, some user tips for this. Once you've got it set up and you're cutting with it, when you're pushing, I'd recommend pushing with the front piece right here and with the handle of your saw and holding everything sideways up against your workpiece so the fence can ride against the edge. If you push with the back here, this little convenient handle, if you push hard sideways, you can see it flexes some. That's just because it's plastic and it's got some play in it. I've still get good, accurate results, but the problem here is if you push sideways with this and squeeze your workpiece against the blade, you could cause some kickback on the back side here. So always, if you're pushing sideways, make sure it's in front of the blade that you're pushing sideways. Other limitations of this setup, if you don't have a perfectly straight edge to reference off of with the rip cut, you're not going to get a perfectly straight cut. That's why they made the AccuCut, so you can both cut across plywood or so you can do a perfectly straight edge without having a perfectly straight reference edge. So this is great if you want to cut a piece of plywood lengthwise. You've got a straight factory edge to run this fence against, and you don't want to do more than a 2 foot wide piece. It is nice this goes all the way up to 2 feet wide because it lets you rip a piece of plywood in half. So you can do lengthwise cuts. You can't do cross cuts with this on stuff that's more than 2 foot wide, and that's where the AccuCut comes into play. Now Kreg does not recommend ripping anything thinner than 1 inch with this. I have successfully ripped down to 1/4 inch. This guide does fit below that saw base plate, so with the way it's set up, you can slide it all the way up against so you have 0 clearance. When you get to less than 1/4 inch though, you could be keeping this blade guard from going back down when you've got the guide set there, and you just got to be careful about that. And I think that's the reason Kreg recommends not ripping closer than that. Also, if you're a lot closer than that, your hand's just on the edge of this instead of being in this guide. You can always put your hand up here like I recommend, but I think they're also worried about someone getting their fingers in the blade like this. So there's some risks with cutting less than 1 inch. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, then don't. So I get very consistent cut widths as soon as you have it dialed in. I always recommend cutting on a scrap piece every time you take the saw in and out of this, even though you have this little stop block for a setup. So check with a scrap piece. Once you've got that set up, good to go. I've cut dimensional lumber with this. I've cut plywood with this. I've even cut polycarbonate with this and gotten really good results with it. So just keep in mind, you got to keep this fence up against your workpiece. I always push at the guide rail because that gives you the most sturdy point to push from. It also keeps your hand away from the blade. So I do like that it does have the guide rail in front and behind the blade, so that gives you a reference surface the whole time that you're cutting as well. Let's talk compatibility. I've used this on a variety of saws, all the way from 5 3/8 inch blades to 7 1/4 inch blades full size. I've had no issues with getting the saw to fit on the sled and clamp down correctly. I've used this on the Milwaukee M12 fuel, the Gen 2 M18 fuel, the rigid brushless saw, the 7 1/4 inch, and the 7 1/4 inch Ryobi brushless saw. None of those had any compatibility issues with fitting on this sled, which is a great adaptability considering the bases on these very wide. The price point on this is $40 for the kit. I think that's a little bit high. I'd like to see it at $30 to $35, I think. I would get it again at the $40 price point. I think it does a pretty good job of what it's designed for. Just know if you're rough on your tools, it's probably not going to last too long. And for the $40 price point, I really would like to see at least the sled made out of a glass-filled nylon instead of just regular injection molded plastic. So let me know if you have any questions in the comment section below. And once again, don't forget to subscribe.